Well, good afternoon. I'm Father David. Thank you for joining me today as we are moving into the 18th week in Ordinary Time. And today we're going to be looking at fixing our eyes on Christ as we move through this very special season. And so I want to dive right in because in Numbers 12, Miriam and Aaron are criticizing Moses and basically forgetting his authority came not from man, and he didn't just put himself in charge of this whole thing and give himself this mission. This mission actually was given to him by God. And so as this kind of, is happening, we see how God is responding in verse 6 through 8. And so we read this. Should there be a prophet among you, in visions will I reveal myself to him. In dreams I will speak to him. Not so with Moses. Throughout my house he bears my trust. Face to face I speak plainly to him, and not in riddles. The presence of the Lord he beholds. Why then did you not fear to speak against my servant Moses? So we see in this that Moses' humility and God's faithfulness kind of become a sort of eternal focus. And our theme this week at Holy Communion Church is God is on the move, granting eternal focus. And so we're kind of looking at it from this angle of today's scriptures. And we can kind of glimpse in that how humility and seeking God's guidance is not just some exercise demanding things be according to the way we want them to be. Now, we all struggle with this. Yours truly also. I mean, I've got a way I want things to be. And that can be hard, too, because, when things aren't going the way we want them to go, then it requires trust and it requires humility, a kind of laying down of whatever we're holding on to at the foot of the cross and kind of a reliance on God, right? And we see this again in the New Testament reading from Matthew 14, where Peter steps out of the boat and he's walking towards Jesus on the water, and he's humbly trusting in what's going on in that moment as he's fixed his eyes on Christ, just like Moses was kind of trusting in God as he was beholding God face to face. But when Peter shifts his focus from Christ and God's presence in that moment to the size of the waves and the storms, he begins to sink in that chaos. And so we see he yells out there, and it says Exodus. That should say Matthew 14:31. In Matthew 14:31, he yells out, "Lord, save me." And I love the compassion of Jesus, right? Because this should teach us valuable lessons about eternal focus. Jesus immediately reaches out to answer Peter's need. And that's an important thing to think about. So oftentimes, maybe that's all it takes. It takes us kind of reaching out to God and then God realizing that. There's this passage in James that says, if we will draw nigh to God, he will draw nigh to us. And the mental picture I've always gotten when I've thought about that is if I'll just take one step towards God, God's going to meet me the rest of the way, right? And the truth is, as I thought about that more, God's never absent. It's just our focus that we take away from God in our situation. So, yeah, Jesus immediately reaches out to answer Peter's need. Yet we see in this kind of Peter's fall was not because of his own weakness, but simply a momentary shift in focus. Now, not too long ago, I took a group from our church on a rafting trip down the river. And this is interesting because one of the things they did was put people out on the front of the boat during some of the lighter whoop-de-doo waves so you could kind of ride it like a rodeo. But I'm going to talk about another spot on the river that actually grabbed my attention because one of the boats in our group got lodged on top of a high surface rock as we left a waterfall. I didn't get a picture of that because we didn't carry phones on the trip and there was only certain places along the river where pictures were taken. But I could tell some of the people in that boat were a little bit anxious as the boat was kind of stuck and the waves and stuff were going by, and especially the guide. The guide was anxious, but not because the boat was stuck. It's because they had a rule, we found out, that if you have to get out of your boat as a guide to get you unstuck off of this particular rock that's on the other side of a waterfall, because I guess this happens a lot, then you have to buy every of all the other guides a beer. And so so the guide was like in the boat and they're like pushing hard and they're scooting and they're trying to do everything to resolve this without the guide having to get out of the boat because the guide didn't want to buy people beer. And the other boats were literally pulled to the side. Like we even pulled our boat to the side to watch to see if they were going to get out. And all the other guides and the other rafts were really paying attention to see if this guide was going to get out. And of course, they were there to help, in case something went south, they could, rescue anybody that might fall out of the boat or whatever. But the guide, experienced and confident, didn't want to get out of the boat. So, she knew the moment her feet hit the current, things could go very wrong. So she waited. She stayed balanced, focused, and with some strategic shifting, with some interesting paddle work, the raft was dislodged. And that image kind of stayed with me, and it teaches us something about focus, right? In the rough waters, staying in the boat, unless clearly called otherwise, also takes faith. It takes faith to stay in the boat when there's a lot of crazy stuff going on. And you should have seen Rose and Oscar and Liz. These are some older congregants in our church, but youthful at heart because they had a lot of fun. But man, they were being so patient and so focused on what the guide was telling them in that moment. And it kind of reminded me, like, as I thought about this, they were so focused on what the guide was telling them that they had their eyes fixed on, the guide at that moment. But it's a good analogy. So just like Moses stayed faithful to God, humbly trusting, despite being attacked even by his own family, because this is interesting, right? Miriam and Aaron were basically Moses's brother and sister-in-law. And these were people that were criticizing him and his ministry and what he was doing. And that can be hard when that's coming from the inside of your family unit. I know. I mean, that can be difficult. And so just like Peter was fine, though, just as long as he kept his eyes on Jesus, our journey with God depends not on the stability of the waters, not on the stability of the circumstances we find ourselves in. It doesn't depend on people, although people can help and circumstances can help. All that stuff can help us. But it doesn't rely on all that. Our stability and the stability of our gaze and that focus and that comfort comes as we rely on God, as we focus on our authentic perceived mission from God, if you so to speak. And so how about us, right? Are our eyes fixed on Christ today? Or are they on the wind and the waves and maybe the rocks or the critics or the crisis at hand or the confusion? And there's so many things as we go through the seasons of life that can come into play to take our focus away from that center. But what our mind is focused on will have a lot to do with how we feel and how we act and how we respond in those circumstances, whether they're really good or really bad. Staying centered and balanced in that, focused on Christ is important. So that being said, eternal focus isn't a denial of the storms of life or the changing of life or the transformative process of life and how that unfolds. We need to keep our focus on God. It's trust in the one who walks above it all, right? Like the adept walking above the water. That's Christ walking above the storm. fixed on God. And so we fix our eyes on Christ, and that's our application for today, right?